It has now been 15 minutes since the torpedo struck the Lusitania from U-20, and on board was disorganized chaos as passengers ran every which way. The final reading on the spirit gauge on the Lusitania reads out as 25 degrees, and the Lusitania is now a helpless hulk of a ship that is currently dying in her final moments. As the situation became dire, crews still managed to launch as many lifeboats as possible. Seaman Leslie Morton was in a scramble mode, trying to get every lifeboat launched from the ship as quickly as possible. Captain Turner dismissed his crew and officers and lets them know that it's every man for themselves now, and he will remain on the bridge until every person is off the ship. He will walk up to the bridge wing on the port side. As Morton looked on at the dying vessel, he couldn't do anything but save himself. He manages to find his brother John Morton in a lifeboat, and he would release the ropes off the boat and try to pull away from the ship. Little he knew that the gunwale was snagged on the ship, and both brothers jumped into the sea together of debris, chaos, and bodies. Little Leslie knew his brother never knew how to swim. Now here's where the sinking of the Lusitania felt odd. Now, as the water actually did reach the bridge, the Lusitania actually started to even out. And as the bow actually started dropping like a stone, the stern is actually up and is actually twisting unnaturally towards the starboard side. And this actually starts lifting up the stern higher and higher up into the water. By 2:27 p.m., the worst listened, and after the bottom of the hull hit the seabed, the hull begins to twist, and it would be long before the Lusitania sank into the depths below. Towards making her final plunge, many survivors fell into the water. However, some actually choose to go down with the ship, like American theater manager Charles Frohman. As Frohman did not attempt to save himself because of his leg, when the end was approaching, Frohman joined his friends, including actress Rita Jolivet, as she would later recall in that final moment as Frohman grasped Rita's hand and then says his final words on this earth, quoting a line from his Broadway production of Peter Pan, "Why fear death? It is the most beautiful adventure that life gives us." Frohman went down with the ship, while Jolivet survived. Another handful of passengers who had ordeals with the ship's funnels, and in the melee of the sinking, passengers Margaret Guyver, Harold Taylor, Edward Bond, and Inspector William Pierpoint were sucked down into the ship's second funnel, and despite this horrible ordeal, the four of them survived when they were blown out of the funnels from a boiler explosion. However, all three of them ended up covered in soot. While Charles Laureate Jr. was in the water, he felt a Marconi aerial slip by his head and onto his shoulders and pushed him down into the water, upside down. And again, by some miraculous miracle, he survived by kicking hard to free himself. Coincidentally, all of them were rescued by the same lifeboat Leslie Morton was on, although he could hear the long lingering moans of people struggling in the water. As the Lusitania was going down, you may notice that the ship actually slipped underneath the ocean with all four funnels still attached. Now, despite the belief of the funnels that actually did fail, especially in the Ocean Liner Designs RMS Lusitania documentary or in the propaganda poster. Now, these funnels actually never fell. It is believed that the third funnel, earlier into the sinking, canted to the starboard side out of alignment. The list actually developed wasn't severe to the point of the funnels collapsing, unlike what we've seen with the Britannic, to which the funnels did fell over as the ship rolled over on her starboard side. Now, forensic-wise, I'm going to say it once the ship finally slipped underneath the ocean, the funnels actually detached all together in unison. While the ship was making its final plunge, Morton and his brother were trying to swim away from the sinking liner and try to find a raft or a lifeboat. Morton's brother never learned how to swim while Morton was a successful swimmer. Morton would attempt to find his brother swimming through the bodies, deck chairs, lifebelts, and lifeboats. He would witness people falling into the water as the stern rose in the air and the propellers became visible at an angle of 50 degrees. He then would see the Lusitania sink before his eyes as she slowly turned over onto her starboard side. And then, at 2:30 p.m., the RMS Lusitania sank, with 1,198 people remaining in the water. Swimming for his life, Morton found an unnamed, unnumbered collapsible boat, and in the space of time, more men swam to the lifeboat and Morton pulled as many people as he could from the water. That was until the boat sank flush with the water, as this boat held about 80 people. And before the release of Lusitania, an illustrated biography of Volume 2, A Greyhound's Downfall, it was widely accepted that the Lusitania sank in 18 minutes, but for the 110th anniversary of the sinking, the 18 minutes factoid is now likely incorrect. But why is that? In the 1910s, men would carry pocket watches on them for a combination of practical, social, and symbolic reasons. Pocket watches were seen by others as a status symbol, especially wealth and social standings. Now, depending on the material that's actually used, wristwatches, or in military terminology, trench watch or a wristlet, were actually starting to come onto the scene. And these were actually used by soldiers, and they were useful in the trenches and pilots for checking the time and for coordinating maneuvers. Now, if you were to serve the military, and even to this very day, if you ever heard the phrase synchronize your watches, it means to make sure all watches show at the same time for coordinated action and timing of events. And since 1915, it was accepted that Lusitania sank in 18 minutes. However, there were some inconsistencies from the survivors in their reporting on what time the torpedo was struck. Data indicates that Walter Schwieger reported his attack at 2:10 p.m., and McCormick's first SOS call was recorded at 2:11 p.m. Immediately after the Lusitania sank at 2:33 p.m., a message was sent from the old-headed Kinsale, Lusitania sunk. Pair messages were actually recorded from a wireless station in Corkeb, to which retransmitted data at 2:30 p.m., and the earlier messages was recorded as SOS from Lusitania. We think we are off Kinsale. Late position 10 miles of Kinsale. Come at once. Big list. The range narrowed between 2:26 and 2:33 p.m. But how about further? Main reports of the watches actually stopped at 2:30 p.m. Now, similar to the Titanic victims' watches that stopped at 2:20 a.m. or after due to setting incorrectly or damaged by the immersion of water. Now, although there were conflicting reports that 2:30 p.m. seems to be so highly supported, or even a minute after, given the disaster was actually 20 minutes. A quartermaster by the name of Hugh Robert Johnston was asked how long it took for the Lusitania to sink. Even though he didn't consult the ship's clock, he estimated it took about 20 minutes, I should say. And Captain Turner was actually looking at his watch when he received a warning of the torpedo's impact, recalled that it was 2:15 p.m., and his watch stopped at 2:36 and a quarter once he was in the water. Now, however, though, there's a reason why it's actually like this. His pocket watch was actually 5 minutes ahead of everyone else. If one to adjust his clock back to the time of the torpedo impact at 2:10 p.m., it would stop at 2:31 p.m. Now, after looking through all this evidence and, of course, backtracking through the newest Lusitania Illustrated Biography book, it is evident that it took 2 minutes longer for the Lusitania to sink, if not a minute after. So there could be a huge room and a margin of error, but to me, 2:30 is the best supported sinking time rather than the 18 minutes that we originally knew about. The question is, what started the 18 minutes to sink is unknown to be sure. In Captain Turner's May 10th testimony at the Kinsale inquest, Turner said, "She floated for about 18 minutes after the torpedo struck her. My watch stopped at 2:36 and a quarter and struck." He even gave the 2:15 and 2:36 time, which is a span of 21 minutes. On 3 occasions early on, Turner testified that it took 18 minutes for the Lusitania to sink, and Turner's repetition of about 18 minutes was a long-standing foundation for the conclusion that the ship sank. Now, Turner never explained why his watch seemed to be 5 minutes ahead when the ship was torpedoed, and we can conclude that the 20 to 21 minutes is plausible. Now, jumping back to the Lusitania story. As the Irish coast was actually still visible, it's actually not within swimming distance. The water temperature is only 55 degrees. Now, while it is not cold as the water temperature at the time of the Titanic disaster, it actually still produces hypothermia. Those who plunge into the water wouldn't see rescue for as long before succumbing to the cold, and survivors had to wait for hours in the water as rescue ships were actually still on their way. Now, if we actually do turn to one of my favorite Titanic books called On a Sea of Glass, and we go to page 238, there is a chart called Nearly Unsurvivable. This is a chart that gives you all the water temperatures, the exhaustion or consciousness, and the survival time. As we know, for Titanic, sank in 28-degree water, your exhaustion or unconsciousness is around under 15 minutes, and your expected survival time is under 15 to 45 minutes. Now, for Lusitania's case, she sank in 55 degrees of water. Now, nearly double than what Titanic had. And if we go to 50 to 60 degree Fahrenheit area, you would basically experience exhaustion or consciousness within an hour or 2 hours. And your survival time would be an hour to 6 hours. And survivors had to wait for hours in the water. And it was a long delay because the rescue ships that are being dispatched, they don't know if U-20 was still in the area where the Lusitania went down. And Lusitania is to be proven to be just as sinkable as Titanic did 3 years earlier. While in the water, Margaret Galligan prayed for survival and promised to devote her life to God if she was saved. And she did. So did Bridget Lee, as both women surfaced while still holding to each other, and they found a floating deck chair. And a man had joined the ladies, and together, the trio clung onto the chair until they were picked up by a lifeboat. While it is not clear which lifeboat it once was, one chance could be the lifeboat that the Londons were in, and while the lifeboat was sailing in the open sea, some of the occupants managed to rescue people from the water. Sarah Loden would later recall a story where a mother and a 2-year-old child were in the water. As Loden saw the pair holding on his steam chair in the water, however, that child was dead. When the woman was recovered, she whispered to Loden, "Let me bury my dead child first." Then, as the child sank beneath the waves, the woman was pulled into the boat. Tragically, this child was one out of the 1,196 people who perished in the disaster. From one torpedo, it took 20 minutes for the Lusitania to sink. One torpedo costed the lives of nearly 1,196. On land, the news had already got out to London, and a rescue operation is already underway. The mission will be launched from Queenstown, which is about 20 miles from the site of the sinking, and the first ship to be leaving was the HMS Juno, and this ship would have reached the site of the sinking in less than an hour. But once the ship left port, the British Admiralty sent a critical 3-worded message to the Juno: "Urgent, recall Juno." The reason of this is that they were afraid that U-20 may still be in the area or not, and Juno is a valuable military ship, and rather send out a military ship, smaller fishing vessels that were unimportant were sent out to pick up survivors. They were of no value than the HMS Juno. The fleet of fishing vessels would take about 3 to 4 hours to make it to where the wreck site is, and the water temperature that was actually mentioned really pushed the survival limit of those that were still in the Celtic Sea after the Lusitania went down. However, a ship may reach the site sooner. A British oil tanker named the Nagasaki actually picked up the distress signal and made an attempt to go to the wreck site, but due to the position at the time, it ended up in front of a German U-20, to which Schwiegert spotted it, armed a torpedo, got in position and fired at it, and this torpedo just missed the ship. After this failed attack, Schwiegert needed to carry at least one torpedo for the journey home. The crew on the oil tanker ship spotted the torpedo and assumed the distress call was a fake, leading to the tanker for a prominent attack. Now, had U-20 not attempted to torpedo the British tanker, this ship would have made it to the wreck site, and this actually put the passengers in the water in extreme peril. Once the fishing vessels arrived, they started to pick up passengers from the water. One of them that was mentioned was the Wanderer, or the Peel 11, a sail-powered fishing vessel from Peel of Isle of Man. The vessel was the first to arrive on scene for about 2 hours and picked up 160 from 4 lifeboats and took 2 lifeboats in tow and collected people from the water. At the time of the disaster, the Wanderer sailed with a crew of 7, and they assisted survivors and attended to the injured and overexposed. And for the heroism of the crew of the Wanderer, the crew were awarded the Bronze Wanderer Medal. Skipper William Ball was awarded the Silver Medal with the same design. And the next vessel to arrive on scene was the naval patrol boat the Heroine, and this ship picked up 16 from the water. Once all the passengers were all picked up, it would take the passengers to Queenstown, and at 8:10 p.m., the Stormcock arrived at the wharf in Queenstown, where it unloaded the first group of survivors. However, this ordeal was actually not over, as several issues arose when the ship was docked, and for starters, there was only enough space for one rescue vessel at a time. Captain William Turner, who was on board the Flying Fish and unexpectedly did survive the sinking, delayed the disembarkation of the passengers because he had to report the incident to the appropriate authorities, and this caused frustration among the survivors, and many expressed their displeasure with cursing and demands to bring the vessel into port immediately. Eventually, Turner left the Flying Fish to find a harbor inspector, leaving strict instructions not to lower the gangplank. And despite this, several people placed the gangplank over the side of the Flying Fish and assisted the weaker individuals so they could receive medical attention. And one of the people that received this medical attention was Charles Emilius Lariat Jr. And the last vessel to bring survivors to shore was the Bluebell, which reached the wharf at 10 p.m. As people disembarked, Charles Bowring put on his glasses and noticed that the survivors were covered in newsprint pulp. Upon examining these papers, he saw a printed warning from the German embassy that had been issued the same morning before the sinking, a discovery that horrified him. Survivors were actually taken to local hotels, hospitals, and private homes, but what happened to some of those survivors after the sinking, during the rescue, and in the aftermath of the disaster? Captain William Turner, the first person not expected to survive the sinking, as he was on the port bridge wing of the Lusitania during her final moments, but he was knocked off his feet by a wave and ended up into the water. He clung onto a deck chair and awaited rescue, and his actions would later be brought into the light during an inquiry of the Lusitania disaster, to which will be discussed in the next part. Helen Smith was one of the 30 out of the 124 children that survived. She was rescued by Ernest Cowper, a journalist of Toronto, Ontario, Canada, but the same could not be said to her parents and relatives, as her mother Elizabeth, father Alfred, brother Hubbard, and cousins Ronald and Regina Owens did not survive the sinking of the Lusitania. Her aunt Cecilia survived, and Helen Smith went on to be the only child to survive the sinking of the Lusitania without her parents. Ava's dolphin is another out of the 30 of the 124 children that survived the sinking, as she was put into a lifeboat and 2 men tried jumping into it, thus causing it to capsize and spill its occupants out. As Avis was able to reach to the surface, she would be picked up from the ocean, but her 2 nurses were lost. Her friend, author, and professor Ian Holborn also survived the sinking, taken from the ocean and put in a hospital for long-term exposure in the water. Both would remain lifelong friends until Professor Holborn's death in 1935. Both Martin brothers survived and made their journey home to Liverpool via the Holyhead in Wales. In the aftermath, Leslie went to visit the family of Joe Elliott to tell his parents about their son not being on the list of survivors. Charles Lariat Jr. would survive, but his friend and neighbor Lothrop Withington died in the sinking. He would stay in Queenstown and left the following day back to London, as he refused to give any interviews and later became president of the largest book importing firms in New England. His account, The Lusitania's Last Voyage, would be published. A link to this book can be found in the description box below. Master Thomas William Dockery was only 5 weeks old at the time of the sinking. Traveling with his mother, Mabel Doherty, he would be the youngest Lusitania passenger at the time, and he will also survive with his mother. Ruth Logan would survive the sinking, but the same can be said about her son Robert. He would be one of the 94 children that was lost in the sinking. Among those that were lost included the Hubbards, Albert and Alice. And if you think the story of Isidore and Ida Strauss on the Titanic or the Irvings on the Empress of Ireland were tragic enough, this one overtakes them. In the final moments of the Hubbards were seen by Ernest Cowper and Charles Laureat Jr. as both Albert and Alice retreated into a room on the boat deck and then closed the door behind them. You could kind of guess the theme of all three ship sinkings with all three inseparable couples until death does us apart. Chief Engineer Archibald Bryce, who kept the engines running, ended up being entombed inside the ship's engine room with no way out. Alfred Vanderbilt and his valet, Ronald Denya, were last seen helping others into lifeboats, but unfortunately, he couldn't be able to swim as he and Denier gave their lifebelts to save others. May considered his actions notable and knew there were no other lifeboats or lifeboats available. Mr. Vanderbilt's body was never recovered. Passenger Frances Stephens and her infant grandson were those that died. She would be later recovered and be transferred to Canada for interment next to her husband at the Mount Royal Cemetery on board the RMS Hesperian. But ironically, this ship would be sunk by the same U-boat and the same commander that sank the Lusitania just only 4 months later. The stowaways that boarded the Lusitania at New York that were arrested also went down with the ship. Although their names are not known and are not a part of the passengers list or even mentioned on the casualty list, regardless of what nationality they were and what political ideology they represented, war does not discriminate. At the end of the day, 1,197 lives, men, women, and children, were lost. And among the casualties, 128 American civilians were killed. The 1,960 passengers were now caught in the crosshairs of a war they did not ask to be a part of. The sinking of the Lusitania also gained some attention by the name of Lord Mersey, the wreck commissioner who was known for the inquiries of sinkings of both the Titanic and the Empress of Ireland. Over a month later, on June 15th of 1915, the RMS Lusitania disaster inquiry is about to begin.
Sir, I think that those of us who survived have, well, almost a duty to those that didn't to find out why we were left so open to attack. Especially when we were given assurances right at the outset that we would be under the protection of the British Admiralty.